You're listening to the Mannered Podcast.
Talk too much, think too fast, say my bad about the past, try to make the good times last, welcome in, let's laugh. It's that human energy, all our flaws, all melody. Welcome to the show, you see, this is Mannered.
Welcome back to Mannered. I'm your host, Sean Rhoads, and today's a solo show, mostly because I didn't want to drag anyone else into this one. Today's episode is about Easter and the very delicate line we walk as parents between encouraging imagination while lying to our kids. So, at some point in childhood, we all collectively agreed that a rabbit snuck into our homes delivering baskets filled with candy and gifts, and somehow that was tied to Easter, a Christian holiday celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And as kids, we didn't question it. There were no follow-ups, no, hey, mom, something feels a little off about this. Rabbits, eggs, baskets, what does any of this have to do with Jesus? But we didn't ask those questions because the source was trusted. And that's where this gets interesting. The same people telling us that story are also telling us another one that isn't meant to be symbolic or seasonal, but foundational. So today on Mannered, I want to talk about something a little uncomfortable. Are we lying to our kids for fun? And does that make it harder for them to believe us when it actually matters? So let's start here, because this wasn't some coordinated parenting conspiracy. Nobody sat down in a boardroom and said, all right, here's the plan. We're going to introduce a rabbit that lays eggs and just, fills up baskets with candy, breaks into people's homes, and it's going to sell a lot of candy and flowers. No, this was actually a mashup. Eggs have been symbols of new life for thousands of years. Spring, rebirth, renewal, that all makes sense. And then the bunny shows up. From old European folklore, rabbits, known for, let's just say, being pretty productive, became symbols of life and growth. And somewhere along the way, those two things met Easter, a celebration of resurrection, of new life. And we just blended it. It blended all together. And over time, it became tradition, then ritual, then expectation. And now it's just what we do, which is interesting because most traditions don't start out confusing. They just accumulate layers until nobody remembers how all the pieces connect. So here's the real question. Is this actually lying, or is it something else? Because if you ask most parents, they'll say, no, it's just good fun. It's imagination, it's magic, and they're not wrong. They're completely right. It is absolutely fun. I mean, one of the things I look forward to most in becoming a parent were things like this, the playful imagination creation. I mean, I've done so many fun things from, hiding presents under the Christmas tree to, getting creative with Easter baskets. But, I even made my oldest daughter, when she was young, think that she was part of this secret spy kid academy. I delivered a briefcase filled with all of this, information in it, and had her own code name and all of this stuff. It's fun to play into that kid's imagination. But child development experts, even people like Gene Piaget, talk about how kids naturally live in a world of imagination. So for kids, fantasy and reality aren't cleanly separated yet. So when we tell them about the Easter Bunny, they're not evaluating it like a detective. They're receiving it like a story. But here's where things shift. At some point, kids grow out of that phase. They start asking questions. They start connecting the dots, the old FBI board with the yarn drawn in between thumbtacks and all that kind of stuff. And eventually they figure it out. And at that moment right there is fascinating, because it's not just, oh, the bunny isn't real. It's, wait, you knew and you told me anyways? And for most kids, it's not traumatic. It's not some sort of huge trust collapse, but it is a moment. It's a recalibration, where they quietly start to realize even trusted sources can tell stories that aren't true. And And this is where things get a little more delicate. So, because Easter isn't just about baskets and candy, it's about the resurrection of Jesus. And for many families, that's not symbolic. That's not seasonal. It's central. It may be the most central to the Christian religion. So now you've got two ideas being presented. One, a magical story that turns out not to be true, and another, a spiritual truth that is very much what you want your child to believe. And here's the thing, to a child, those don't come from two different categories. They come from the same place. You. You're the narrator. So when one story gets reclassified, it's not crazy to think that they might quietly start evaluating the others. So now, to be fair, most kids grow up just fine. I grew up okay. I went through this whole thing and perfectly okay. So, they can separate tradition from belief as they mature. But I think, I've been thinking a lot about this one, and maybe there is some amount of this is like faith weightlifting, at an early age. Maybe this actually helps build faith, to be able to separate these two things. So maybe it actually is a good thing for faith. I don't know. I'm not an expert in these things, and that's kind of why I wanted this to be a subject today. But, they separate the tradition from the belief as they mature, and their understanding deepens. But the question isn't whether they can figure it out. It's whether we're being thoughtful about how we guide them through that process. And that's what I'm hoping to zoom out a bit today and have us focus on, because most thoughtful voices, whether in parenting or faith, aren't saying, they're not saying cancel the Easter bunny. They're saying be clear about what's what. Many Christian leaders will tell you celebrate, have fun, do the egg hunts, eat the candy, but don't let that become the main story, because Easter at its core is about something much bigger. And from a parenting standpoint, a lot of experts suggest something similar. You don't have to eliminate imagination, but you do want to protect trust, which might mean, framing things as tradition instead of fact. Being honest when kids start asking questions. And that's one that I'm personally, I think, really guilty about, because my wife and I, we are creative people, and we love the creation game of, making them believe. I mean, we go above and beyond to just, really create these experiences for our kids. I mean, when it comes to the elf during Christmas, I mean, we have that thing going crazy. And then, when it comes to Easter bunny, it's like we try to be thoughtful. So in the process of being thoughtful in that tradition, we probably go a little too overboard on it. So, I think, being honest when kids start asking questions, and letting curiosity lead the conversation, not shutting it down. And that's where, we get, when they start asking questions, like, no, we try and guide it away. We should probably embrace into that a little bit. And rather than really trying to push them away from the man behind the curtain kind of thing. So, not shutting it down, not doubling down, but walking, with them through it. So that's at least what some of the experts advise on this subject. And I think this is where, manner lives. So, because this isn't really about bunnies or eggs or even Easter, it's about awareness. It's about understanding that what feels playful to us might feel confusing to someone else, especially someone who trusts us completely. Good manners isn't about being perfect, it's about being thoughtful. It's about asking, am I considering how this lands, not just what I intend, So, and maybe in this case, it looks like, letting kids enjoy the magic while also giving them something deeper to hold on to. So that's going to be really some of the things my wife and I practice moving forward, not replacing one with the other, but making sure, one doesn't crowd the other out. So maybe the question isn't, are we being bad parents for doing the Easter Bunny? That's not really it. And please, once again, don't take it that way. Enjoy the holiday and celebrate the magic. And once again, everything I talk about, this isn't encouraging you to do. This is me just walking through this as a human being here, trying to understand it myself. So, you know, the question is, are we paying attention to the moment when the story changes? I think that's the big part, is really focusing on that, because at some point it always does, and we need to be there during that time. So, and I think how we handle that moment, says a lot more than the story itself ever did. So, because Easter at its core is about belief, and belief doesn't come from getting everything perfectly right. It comes from trust. And trust is built in the way that we show up. We talk about that in nearly every episode. So, especially when truth gets a little more complicated, um, you know, that's where, manners meet the road. And so, just a thought for today as we go into celebrating Easter. Hopefully, I didn't bum anyone out during their Easter holiday, but it was just a focus of mine that I wanted to get out there. If you're watching this the day before Easter or on Easter or after Easter, so once again, celebrate, have fun. At the end of the day, it's all about joining family in celebration. But realizing that creating that magic can happen in multiple ways, and it's not necessarily lying. Embrace the imagination, but also just be aware of that moment, so you can be there with facts and just be there with presence and walk your child through it, to where they truly understand and still have that level of trust with you, and embrace the true story, whatever that is. In any religion, that's what the focus is. And it really makes me think back on the day where I was invited to a Seder dinner from one of my Jewish friends, and we sat down with his family and had Seder dinner. And I thought it was amazing because we literally went through the tradition that was, thousands of years old, of telling the story, the whole story. We each read parts of it. We each had, the different things to do during that dinner, and the playful games that came along the way. The kids had a blast with it. There was not really a make believe item in that, but the kids still had a blast with it. So it was embracing the traditions of the religion, in a true story fashion, by also incorporating things that were fun for kids. So whatever that looks like for you and your family, I think just the main mannered approach for this one is just be conscious about it, be aware of it, and have fun with it.
Thanks for listening to the Mannered Podcast.